Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Dr. Sushant Khurana. Thank you so much for joining us on a Sunday evening for this special webinar series, the first part on managing the respiratory cases in COVID-19. Uh, First of all, I would like to wish and hope that all of you are safe and taking good care of yourself and your loved ones and your patients. Thank you again for joining us. I have a very esteemed panel with me for the discussion. We are joined by Dr. J.C. Suri sir, who's the chairman of Medeor JCS Institute of Pulmonary Critical Care and Sleep Medicine in Delhi. He'll kindly be the moderator as well. I have Dr. Vijay Kumar sir, who's a professor, pulmonary medicine, Medicity Medical College, Hyderabad. Thank you, sir, for joining. I also have with me Dr. B.P. Singh sir. He's the head of the department Pulmonary and Sleep Medicine, Midland Healthcare and Research Institute, Lucknow. Welcome, sir. And I also have Dr. Vijay Hadda sir, who's the associate professor in pulmonary critical care and sleep medicine in AIIMS Delhi, and also one of the forefront fighters in this. So thank you so much, the esteemed panel, for joining us. Dr. Suri, I would request if you could take it forward, please. You will be the moderator as well.
Okay, thank you, Sushant. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this special webinar on recent development in the management of COVID-19. As you all know, COVID-19 is a new disease caused by novel coronavirus SARS-CoV-2, and it all started in December in Wuhan, China, and from there it rapidly spread to practically every country of the world. And if you see today, there are more than 2 million active cases of COVID-19, and more than 1.5 lakh deaths have taken place. Looking into the magnitude of the problem, the morbidity and the severity and the way it has spread in such a short time, it clearly shows that virus is highly infectious and is also lethal. If you see the mortality, it is almost more than 10 times the mortality which we saw in 2009-2010 with H1N1 influenza. At present, in India, we have about just more than 15,000 cases with just more than 500 deaths. If you look into the scenario in India, it looks much better than in other countries, thanks to the proper and timely measure taken by our government, and thanks to our people who are actively participating and taking all the precautionary measures to contain this highly infectious disease as much as possible. But the situation may take a different turn very soon, because the cases are still rising. There are many hot zones which are still there. So it is very important for us to be well aware about the management of this disease and the changing information and the developments which are happening on day-to-day basis. Beginning, if you see, we thought that it is just like any viral disease. As we saw in H1N1, we will have a case of just mild to moderate viral pneumonia, which we can manage with the conservative means, or maybe some cases would require mechanical ventilation. But now we all know, with the information regarding its clinical picture, its clinical course, and the other aspects, we know that this disease is much different than what we would expect from a common viral disease. You see that these patients have a much different pathophysiology. Their initial clinical presentation, as far as the lung involvement is concerned, is much different. Like they are saying that probably the lungs are much more compliant to begin with. So there may be different management issues related to it. Then there are issues related to infection control. We also see that a lot of patients are developing a severe form of DIC, with massive thrombi and emboli, both venous and arterial system. In some cases, we are seeing in cases like purpura fulminans type of picture. And we also see that in many of these cases have cytokine storm, leading to sudden deterioration of their deterioration in their clinical condition, worsening of their ARDS, kidney injury, and also development of multi-organ failure. So this is a selective issues. There are specific problems which may require specific therapies, which we need to be aware of, because once we are going to face these cases more so in near future, we should be well versed with all these issues and their management. And luckily, in this last 2-3 months, a lot of information has come, and we can actually learn from the experiences of other people in other countries like China, Italy, UK, and US. So and luckily the information which is coming up is being rapidly shared also. So in today's webinar, what I would like to do is to take a few important issues, which are little contentious, and the issues where the clear-cut answers are not there, and when you are confronted with them in your day-to-day clinical practice, how you are going to manage. And for that, I have a very distinguished panel of experts who have a lot of experience in dealing with in general respiratory problems. Of course, this problem is new to us, and our experience is gradually increasing as far as managing this problem is concerned. So first, I would start with the transmission, transmission of infection. There has been a lot of confusion and controversy regarding whether it is a droplet infection or it is an airborne infection, and what kind of precaution we should be taking, whether we should wear simple surgical mask or we should use the N95. We have also seen that a lot of healthcare workers have been, despite the use of all the important protective gears, about 15 to 20% of healthcare workers have been affected by this, and there are also deaths of the healthcare workers. So is it because we are not using the proper gear, or maybe in the initial phase we just ran out of their number, or we need to probably have a different approach in terms of changing them a little faster, or this thing? For all this, I would start with Dr. Vijay Kumar. What are your views about this?
Yeah, we have seen similar epidemics in the past related to this COVID-19 virus. We had MERS, and then we had SARS before, and then H1N1 very recently. Mm-hmm. And all of them belong to the similar family, and all of the behavior of all these viruses are very similar. And now World Health Organization has said that this is a respiratory infection. That means it will spread only through the droplet infections. Mm-hmm. Of course, when we say droplet, we are talking about those big particles which are about 10 microns and more. But then, of course, these droplets can only travel only to the extent of about for 1 meter or 1.5 meters. But then there are some small particles coming from the respiratory tract, which are called the aerosols. They are much smaller, less than 5 microns, or even smaller than that. But they can travel for a longer distance. But the density, the population of these droplets or aerosols is very, very less. So as a result, the viral load will be very less on those particles. So the important thing is the first 1 meter or 1.5 meter, where the huge droplets carrying millions and millions of viruses are the ones which are responsible of transmission from one infected person to another individual who is healthy.
I am talking with particular reference to healthcare workers and those who are working in wards having COVID positive patient, and also in the ICU. Because there is a lot of, I think about 15 to 20% of healthcare workers have been affected by this, particularly in the China and others in Italy. So, so you think that we need to have some different approach in terms of...
World Health Organization has computed that close to 13,300 people got infected, the healthcare workers, both doctors, nurses, and other paramedics. And it is mostly because most of these COVID-19 positive patients are in ICUs, where there is a lot of nebulization taking place, where a lot of intubations are taking place. And sometimes there can be a bronchoscopy being done in these patients. And sometimes there could be a non-invasive ventilator in action.
So
So
you think
all
these should be done in a separate room with the negative pressures effect, or once you have an ICU and all patients are having COVID-19, then it can be done in the general in the ICU, and we can take proper precautions in terms of using N95 and this thing. So
Absolutely.
this was yeah. So
One
Dr.
is
Bhatta,
to
please, sorry, please.
One is to minimize the procedures which are capable of generating the aerosols.
Yeah.
Second thing is a proper protective gear like PPE, N95 mask, goggles, and the visors. And the third is to reduce those procedures which are capable of generating the aerosols.
Okay. Dr. Hadda, you have seen that these things must have been practiced in most of the ICUs. Still, we had such a high rate of infection in the healthcare workers. So what do you think could be the reason for that, and what you think you want to, tell the doctors here they should do so that it can be less in our setup?
First of all, I would like to thank Dr. Vijay. He has made he has highlighted the main points. But I think there are few issues which still persist in patients who are admitted in ICU and the healthcare worker who are taking care of those patients. First thing, if we start with the patient, many patients will require endotracheal intubation, and that is right saving, and we have to intubate the patient, and to intubate the patient, we need to go very close to the patient. So that is one step where we should take extra precautions. There are different approaches which have been suggested to intubate this patient. Many organizations have suggested that we should use video laryngoscope so that we can intubate from distance, and we need not to peep into the throat of the patient, so the distance will increase. Secondly, the people have used some box kind of arrangement so that the aerosol, the generation of aerosol can be reduced, or at least the contact of the aerosol to the healthcare provider can be reduced. Similarly, if we are giving NIV is one therapy which is, I think, most dangerous among all these things. In our experience, we have tried to give NIV to some patients, and first thing is these patients are keep on coughing. So that is very, very troublesome feature among these patients, and they are unable to tolerate. So what we keep on doing is we will again go to the patient and again try to fit the mask or like that. So that is another thing which exposes the healthcare worker to this. Then coming back to the healthcare workers, I think although we are taking all the precautions related to maybe mask, maybe dedicated gears, different PPEs, but I think there are few steps where there can be a problem. One thing is when we are doing this procedure, but I think most important step is donning and doffing. That is the most crucial step, is probably doffing. When we are removing all these gears, then probably we will require more help from more people. In our institute, at least 2 nurses are there which are helping us while we are doffing. So I think that is very crucial phase when we are doffing. Doffing is the most important thing where I think chances of getting infection is high likelihood. I think if we can take care of these things, then probably we can reduce the chances of healthcare workers being infected by this virus.
Okay. Dr. BP Singh, do you want to add something to this? Is there any need to change a little more frequently these gears? You think maybe because of the shortage, probably people ran out of them, or that was the reason, or maybe if you are using it for too long a period of time, that can also be a factor, or anything else you want to add?
I think most of the things are being covered. Only thing that I just wanted to tell, probably we are short of this negative pressure rooms where these patients should be intubated, as Dr. Hatta has mentioned. If we are having a COVID-19 patient, they should be kept in the negative pressure rooms in the isolation. However, it is not possible in most of the places in our country. And the rooms where you require minimum 12 exchanges per hour. That is also not possible most of the time. And also, if you are doing procedures, as he has mentioned, the aerosol generating procedures, all precautions has to be taken. Probably we might not be able to fulfill it because of the reason of the, I'm not talking about the aims, it is because the non-availability of the PPE in the N95 mask all over the country. Probably that is the biggest challenge what we are going to face if we are managing these patients outside of the tertiary institutions in the country. So this is one of the issues probably which is very important in these patients. For my transmission, probably this is also one of the important issues apart from the droplet infection, which is very important in these patients. As far as the NIV, as it has just been mentioned, the NHS data is also saying even the there's a position paper by Devon Rappaport also, they have been also recommending few of the selected patients for the use of NIV. Although we can take this later on, but different, even in the Wuhan, even in the Lombardy data, they have used NIV in a couple of the patients, almost 1/3 to 2/3 even. So these are the different issues, although this is very important in this group of patients, how we are going to use. Because if we talk of the NIV use, probably it is the non-vented mask with the single limb and using HME bacteria viral filter in between the expiratory port and the mask will be useful, an important step in preventing the dissemination of virus into the environment.
Okay, so one thing is there, although you maintain that it is a droplet infection, but all the people in the ICU as well as in the ward when they are managing these patients should wear N95. Is that the one I can take as a consensus for you?
100%.
Yes.
Anything, Dr. Sushant, you want to say?
I completely agree with all of you. Please, I just wanted to make one announcement for the participants, if you allow me to, please.
Sure.
So for for the participants, we'll open the question answer box at 5:45, so they can start pouring in their questions if they have any to ask from the panelists. I'm assuming and hoping most of the queries would be covered while you guys discuss. But if there is anything left, we can probably just take it at the end of the seminar. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Sushant. So we just talked about transmission and infection prevention. And during this period, the issue of non-invasive ventilation and other things came. So once you have a patient either in the ward or in the ICU who has developed hypoxemia or who has already gone into respiratory failure and is in the early respiratory failure where you can manage this patient with oxygen alone. There has been a lot of, again, controversy that there are some group who wants to intubate this patient early because they feel that these patients can deteriorate very rapidly and then become much more sick, and early intubation is the key. But on the other side, people feel that, a significant group of patients can be actually well oxygenated with the use of either nasal cannula, or you can use rebreathing mask with reservoir bag, or HFNC, the high flow nasal cannula. Now, high flow nasal cannula and NIV, and in the NIV particularly if you are using CPAP. So these two, as you have just mentioned, they are both potentially aerosolizing devices and modalities. So what would be your approach? That once you have a patient, would you like to treat them with the high flow nasal cannula or say CPAP, or a low flow, mask, non-rebreathing mask with reservoir bag. And maybe these patients are conscious, and in some cases you can use prone position to treat. And it has been seen that many patients can actually come out and recover and go without getting intubated for this thing. So what will be your approach? Because the problem is basically, as we said, that infection control concerns, and particularly many people feel that many of them would ultimately land up into intubation. And if we delay intubation, then that can be again harmful not only for the patient but also for the healthcare workers, because crash intubation is also going to be a aerosol generating procedure. So how you are going, you would like to approach these patients? At what point you would consider them to give these non-invasive methods, and from where you would like to change, and how frequently you would like to monitor them? Dr. Hadda, if you could start with this.
I think the general principle remains same. Whenever patient is having hypoxemia, we start with the conventional oxygen therapy. But I think in COVID, there are two issues which we need to consider while we are selecting what mode of oxygenation we are going to choose. So one thing is the infectivity rate, means it is highly infectious. Second thing is the pathophysiology of the respiratory failure, because in few studies it has been described that the pulmonary problem can be classified in two categories. It's the L type and H type. Basically,
Yes.
it has been divided by some Gatonini group from Germany, and they have studied few patients, and they described that one group there is a low elastance, low lung water, and their lungs are very compliant. And there is another group where there is a water load of lung is high, and this compliance is very low. And similarly, so if these two groups behave differently, in the first group, usually patient will be less dyspneic as compared to second one. And because lungs are very compliant, then probably they will not require any kind of PEEP, and their lungs do not require any kind of recruitment kind of thing. They do not require recruitment. So if patient is CT or the radiology is also slightly different, they will have patchy kind of consolidation, peripheral kind of thing. So most of the lungs are spared, only patchy involvement is there. So those kind of patients are slightly lesser sick, and although these are more physiological and this one, but clinically how they present they will be slightly less dyspneic. So those patients we can start with oxygen alone, maybe simple nasal cannula or venturi mask, and if we are able to manage the FPO2 between 92 to 96, then it's good enough. But if we are unable to maintain that oxygenation, then definitely we need to go for higher kind of thing where we can have more control over the FiO2. And in that group comes the non-breathing mask or HFNC. In non-breathing mask, we all know that because many times these patients minute ventilation is too high, the demand is so high, we are unable to oxygenate with them. So those kind of patients we can go for HFNC. One concern which I was discussing regarding this was high infectivity. So there is always a concern that if we give HFNC, then everybody will think that there are more chances of spread of infection. But there is some data which suggests that if we compare the infection rate with the conventional oxygen versus HFNC, it's almost similar. So there is no extra risk of giving HFNC as far as the infection rate is concerned. So probably this is not a major concern when we are choosing HFNC, if we take in account that the catching of infection by a healthcare worker is almost same as conventional oxygen therapy.
Okay.
Yes, but if we need to keep in mind that if we delay unnecessarily, then these patients can rapidly deteriorate. So any patient where we are giving conservative therapy in the form of oxygen or HFNC, we need to be very, very vigilant. And if patient crashes, then the whole process will go other way, because if there is as you discussed, if there is emergency kind of intubation, then the whole precaution cannot be taken and chances of getting infection by healthcare worker increases. So that also we need to keep in mind. If the patient is unable to be oxygenated with this one, then probably we will go straight with endotracheal intubation. As far as NIV is concerned, currently all of these organizations, the experts, they are probably against an NIV. It should not be used as a first line this one, and there are multiple physiological bases for that. Because ARDS, we require volume control. So while we are giving NIV, we cannot have any kind of control over volume. They usually deliver a high kind of volume. Usually volumes are usually more than 10 ml per kg body weight kind of thing. Similarly, most of the time these patients keep on coughing, so they are unable to tolerate. So probably NIV is lower down. So if we are unable to oxygenate them with conventional or HFNC, then it's better to go straight away with intubation, and we can then take care of that.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Hadda. Dr. Vijay, what do you think? Would you consider your patients in the early stage use of some non-invasive methods of oxygenation, and what will be your threshold to get into intubation?
I would like to frame my answer based on three very important things. One is the editorial from Gattinoni, who said a lot of things about the pathophysiology of the COVID-19. The second one is the article written by Tobin, how to ventilate and how to separate these patients. And the third one is the postmortem reports coming from Wuhan, all those patients who have died, and then when they have conducted the postmortem. And they said there seems to be a lot of vascular thrombosis. And that is the reason why they said probably there is a huge cytokine storm and breaking of the RBCs.
Yeah, we'll be talking about this in the next section. But
Yeah,
this is
so
a special reference to that question. You know.
Right. So basically, all both Tobin and Gattinoni, they have divided these patients into those who have predominant hypoxia. They have to be managed with only oxygenation, whether it is high flow nasal cannula or NIV, CPAP, or any other oxygenation methods. But those who have a clear-cut picture of ARDS, they have to be intubated and ventilated. And he said the people who fall into this hypoxic group are about 30%, and people who fall into the ARDS group are probably 70%. And there again, this ARDS is not the type of ARDS that we are all grown up with, where we require very high PEEP, etc. There we have to use the ARDSNet trial protocol, but at the same time, not very high PEEP. So early intubation will work wonders there. That is what they have said.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Vijay. Dr. VP Singh, would you like to comment on this?
Yes. I just want to add few things. Actually, there are two different schools of thought to start with. Actually, in managing these patients, if you look at the surviving sepsis guideline, they mention patient is hypoxic, to start with oxygen. Patient is not tolerating, not improving, just go with HFNC. If HFNC is not available, add or not improving with HFNC, start with NIV. But you have to see that whether this patient is a candidate for intubation or not. If patient is not a candidate for the intubation, then move in this order up to a level when the patient is not tolerating NIV or not improving with HFNC, both of the things, then you have to intubate, and intubation has to be done by the most experienced person in the rapid sequencing intubation, in the negative pressure room if possible.
Okay.
This is what. Another school of thought is NHS. They say there are three zones of the patient: the green zone, the yellow zone, and the red zone. Green zone is the patient having respiratory rate more than 20 with SpO2 more than 94%, less than 94. They require oxygen. Just maintain it. If the patient is comfortable with this, just continue it. If patient is not maintaining, add the rebreathing mask of 15 liters of oxygen. If patient is still not maintaining, add CPAP. They are against using the high flow nasal cannula, the NHS group, the UK group. They say start with the CPAP with non-vented mask, with a single limb, with the HME, with the bacterial viral filter in between the expiratory port and the non-vented mask, and use the pressure of 10 centimeter of water. If patient is not improving, closely monitor it every 30 to 60 minutes. And if the patient is doing well, continue it. If it is not, you can switch, rather increase up to 12 centimeter or even 15 centimeter. But closely monitor these patients so that they should not crash. If they not improve, just go to the treatment escalation plan of rapid sequence intubation and management of patient further. So this is how the two schools have been advocating these two types of therapy. And
please go on.
So that, and then you start with the ventilating these patients. Start after the intubation, depending
we will
upon
talk about intubation after this. Right now, actually, we were only thinking pre-intubation, whether we should continue. So to summarize what I think I gathered from all of you, that the decision to initiate any non-invasive method of oxygenation would depend on balancing the risk and benefit to the patient, the risk of exposure to healthcare worker, and also the best use of the resources, available to us in a particular situation, whether we have so many ventilators or not. We can even use our CPAPs, which a patient of sleep apnea are using, those CPAP and BiPAPs. When you are using BiPAP, you are basically using the CPAP mode and not the BiPAP mode of this thing. And once, I think, and some people also say that you can use maybe high flow nasal cannula in younger patients without comorbidities when they can tolerate these nasal cannula better. And then on the other hand, if you have an old patient with comorbidities, maybe you and very high risk factors, maybe you may go in for intubation far earlier. So what is important is that you have to be very vigilant. You monitor these patients very closely. You should do frequent blood gases. At least every 1 to 2 hours, you should do these blood gases, and your threshold for intubation should be very low. That's what is important, is that once you think that your patient is not improving or patient is deteriorating, then I think it is better not to wait till they become acutely ill and you will end up into acute or a crash intubation, which is, I think, going to be much more harmful or much more aerosol producing and dangerous for both patient and the healthcare workers. So yeah.
Dr. Suri, I have 2 points here to add, with your permission.
Sure.
Yeah. Number one is those who are using high flow nasal oxygen, there is a chance of some aerosol generation.
Yes.
So it has been shown that if we can put a surgical mask on top of the high flow nasal oxygen, then the amount of aerosol generation and spread into the room is much less. So it gives a lot of safety. And secondly, when we are putting the high flow nasal oxygen, if the flow is about 30 liters, the aerosol generation is almost nothing. Only when it is to the tune of 50 liters or 60 liters, then probably the aerosol generation is very high. And that point that you mentioned, that you have to be very vigilant when the patients are on NIV or on oxygen, is very important, very valid. There is one particular scoring system which will guide us, and that is the PCO2 by FiO2. If the PCO2 by FiO2 is more than 150, probably we can decide, initiate NIV and continue with NIV. And if the PCO2 by FiO2 is less than 150, then those patients are not candidates for NIV.
Okay, so you mean to say the patients who have background COPD and this problem and may develop hypercapnic respiratory failure, probably this may be a better choice for this. Okay.
Yes.
So I think these two are very, very important points. In fact, any flow, nasal flow going beyond 40, and if you are not able to oxygenate your patient with an FiO2 of 0.6, I think that is an important indication for intubation. So rapidly deteriorating patients and those you are not able to oxygenate, intubation is an important thing. So do you think these patients should be intubated in the ICU, or you should have a separate intubation room with the negative pressure or this thing? So the first patients are in the ward, and if suppose they deteriorate with non-invasive methods, then they should go to an intubation area, and from there they should go into the ICU areas. What do you think by separating then the risk of aerosolization and risk of healthcare workers' exposure to this can be affected by this? Just quick comments on this, because we have to talk of other 2-3 important things. Dr. Hadda.
I think here it depends whether we are intubating electively or it is emergency situation.
No, whenever you decide, because it should not be an emergency. Once you decide this intubation should be within the ICU, or you think there should be a designated area for intubation?
So that is ideal if we have some dedicated area, but because most of the hospitals are not equipped like that, most of hospital, if you talk about India, we don't have any room which is negative pressure. So in our institute, we have divided two parts: the COVID area and non-COVID area. So any patient who is coming to our hospital, and we take that patient to COVID suspect area, and there we do screening. And once screening is positive, then the patient go to COVID positive area or COVID area. If the patient requiring any intubation, so probably we intubate there only. We are not taking that patient to other any dedicated area because we don't have any dedicated area for intubation. So wherever patient is there in COVID area, we intubate and we take all the precautions which are described by CDC, WHO, and even ICMR, using all the gears, including N95 mask and all those things. But we don't have any dedicated area, and probably it will be true for almost all the hospitals. They don't have any negative pressure room where patient can be shifted and can be intubated. But there are few things which are described, like you should use a video laryngoscope for intubation. The most experienced person should go for intubation, and then you can use a box-like thing, which are intubating box are available there, so that can be used to minimize the spread of aerosols to the person who is intubating like that.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Hadda. Dr. Vijay Kumar, once the patient is intubated, so what will be the best strategy to ventilate them? Because recently there have been, as Dr. Hadda was mentioning, as per the Gattinoni paper in Blue Journal, there are L type and H type, and the patients who are highly compliant, probably they are not recruitable, and there you don't need to use high PEEP. And there's another group, which usually comes with cytokine storm, where the ARDS is fulminant and very typical ARDS what you see in bacterial sepsis. Those patients, probably the approach may be high PEEP. And so what is, there is another group which said that they don't agree with this high compliant theory, which is non-compliant, because they see that if you use a particular mode like APRV, and APRV is a mode where, you are giving two pressures, two PEEPs, and then there is an intermittent deflation of the lung. They see that within a period of few hours, most of these patients, they are able to recruit. So the recruitability, if you are seeing from the point of view of immediate recruitment with the recruitment maneuver, maybe within 5 to 10 minutes, that may not happen. But these are the patients who actually recruit very slowly, and they found that this mode has been much more useful. But in the otherwise standard, what do you think should be the best way to ventilate them, Dr. Vijay Kumar?
Yeah. In the same Gattinoni paper, he said that when the patients were ventilated according to the ARTSNet protocol, the mortality was 60%. But when the patients were ventilated according to the physiology, if it is a good compliance, less PEEP, and when the compliance is very less, keep on increasing the PEEP between the high infection and lower infection points, then the mortality was almost zero. So I think the physiology plays a very important role, and it is very important for us to recognize the compliance. Very important to look at the ABG frequently, and also look at the plateau pressures and the peak pressures constantly. And of course, this is not to talk about the comorbid conditions. And the comorbid conditions includes not only chronic obstructive lung disease, coronary artery disease, but also age. Many of these patients where the mortality was very high were all plus 70, and it was even higher in plus 80 years of age. And in another publication, very recently, last week, elderly people who were diagnosed as COVID-19 positive and who were treated according to the ARTSNet trial, the mortality was 80%. So it only goes to show that it is not a straightforward ARDS, but
so
there are multiple issues.
What mode you will use? What are the PEEP strategy? Can you just tell in 2-3 lines so that for our listeners?
Yeah, I think if the compliance is good, then probably PEEP also should be much less. And that only means that protein-rich fluid has not flooded the alveoli. So we are only trying to give some support to the respiratory muscles and unload the respiratory muscles so that we can buy time while whatever it is, the cytokine storm or inflammation that comes down, and while the pharmacotherapy can be started and it can be helpful. So it is only to buy time.
Dr. VP Singh, anything you would like to say?
No, that's all. Actually, Dr. Vijay Kumar has very clearly mentioned that you have to follow the lung physiology while deciding the approach in the ventilating these patients. He has mentioned the compliance is good, low PEEP is good enough. If compliance is low, then you have to go to the high PEEP along with the low tidal volume strategy. That's all I think.
So low tidal volume strategy. Dr. Hadda, your final remarks, comments on this ventilation mode and PEEP selection.
Sir, I think more or less I agree with both of the panelists. More or less it's same. I think there's nothing to add it. But I think once we start the ventilation, then compliance is the determinant how we will go about. If the patient is having good compliance, then probably PEEP will be less and there is no use of that. And if compliance is low, then probably PEEP higher may be required. And among those patients, probably recruitment maneuver can also be useful too, to some extent.
When will you consider proning these patients?
So I think once you have started the ventilation and you think that you have done all your permutation combination of the PEEP and FiO2 and still you are unable to oxygenate those patients, then it's better to start early. It should not be delayed very long kind of thing. Maybe within few hours, 4 to 6 hours is a good time period where we can decide whether we are able to oxygenate the patient with the strategy what we are following. If we are unable to, then I think straightway we can go ahead with prone position ventilation among these patients.
And Dr. Suri, Dr. Suri, I wanted to add two very important points for patients who are intubated.
Right.
Number one is, as soon as we intubate, we have to make sure that the endotracheal tube is clamped. And number two is...
to prevent aerosolization.
Exactly.
Okay.
And number two is we have to use the closed suction method rather than, opening the circuit and then trying to do the suctioning.
Okay.
Because this will reduce the aerosol generation.
I think these are two very, very important practical points, from infection control point of view. Yeah, Sushant, you want to say something?
Sushant, sir, we can add one more. Yeah.
Dr. Sushant, you want to say something?
Let Dr. Vijay complete. Please, Dr. Vijay Hadda, please complete. Then I'll just...
Sir, I think two more practical points are, I think we should not use humidifier. Because if we are using humidifier, then we will require disconnection of the circuits in between to empty the trap. So we should not use humidifier, and also we should use extra filter kind of thing.
HEPA filters.
HME filters.
Yes. HME filters and a bacterial filter in the expiratory limb or expiratory port. So if we can add this one, then probably chances of spread of infection will be further minimized.
Okay. Quickly, because we have now little time, we have to take the questions also. So two issues I would like to discuss. One, the role of steroids. What do you think is in the current position, particularly when we are suspecting cytokine storm, particularly at the end of the first week when the patient suddenly starts deteriorating, the lung infiltrate becomes much more, patient becomes hypoxic, and there is a multi-organ dysfunction develops. So this is considered to be due to dysregulated inflammation, and many people feel that it is not due to the virus per se, but because of the inflammation, and they have proposed the use of steroids. So what do you think about the decision to start steroids? At what point of the time? What should be the dose and the duration of steroid which we should be using? Dr. Vijay Kumar.
Use of steroids in the ARDS, non-viral ARDS, we have all known. And there were wonderful papers where they went on doing lung biopsies every day after intubation in ARDS patient, and they said day 7 is the day when we have to start steroids. When it comes to viral ARDS like this COVID-19, we have experience coming from Wuhan, China, where they have used steroids to a very good effect, and they have written a letter and a publication to Lancet saying that we have used steroids with very good effect and very good improvement. Number of ventilator days have come down, ICU days have come down, and survival has improved. The only organization which is not very much in favor of using steroids is the World Health Organization. They have based their opinion based on one of the papers which said in MERS, it did not really show much effect. But then very recently, just last week, the Society for Critical Care Medicine and European Society for Intensive Care Medicine, both of them, they said, we have enough evidence to show that steroids are wonderful. They are anti-inflammatory. They are good for cytokine storm, and we should use it, and we should use it till the patient improves.
Dr. Hadda, are there any lab parameters like ferritin levels or D-dimer levels or CRPs, which you think can guide in starting steroids in these patients?
Sure, sir. Yeah. Actually, the cytokine storm can be diagnosed based on clinical criteria, where patients will be hemodynamically unstable, there will be organomegaly, and like that. And then there are lab parameters. The common lab parameters which are being used include the CRP, the various interleukin levels, especially interleukin 6, TNF alpha, and other interleukins also. And then many labs use ferritin also. If very high ferritin indicate that the patient is having secondary hemophagocytosis, that is also part of this. So I think the use of interleukin level and ferritin level and CRP combined with the clinical scenario, if these are there, then we can easily make up the diagnosis of cytokine storm.
So you agree with the steroids to be given in such patients?
Yes, sir. Actually, we don't have much of options. Either we give steroids or we have some immunomodulator or immunomodulator.
Tocilizumab.
Tocilizumab is one, and interleukin 1 inhibitor anakinra is the second one.
Anakinra, what you call that?
Yeah, anakinra. I think, but still the experience is not very great. Although people have used with anecdotal success, but there are no well-designed trials, neither for steroids nor for the other two drugs what we are mentioning. Even for steroids, that is mentioning, Dr. Vijay is mentioning, they are mostly case series. There is no randomized control trial. So we need to take that conclusion with slightly skeptical kind of thing. We cannot be relying our recommendation based solely on those kind of observations. So, but yes, there are some data which suggests that steroid usage can be useful in these conditions, and even tocilizumab. A few of my friends which are there in US or UK, they are also giving some feedback that they have also used, but experience again is not very positive. There are only few patients which are recovered. Here we have given to 2 patients in our institute, and unfortunately we found they are not useful. Steroid we are giving, and by policy we have decided that we will give methylprednisolone around 40 milligram per day, twice daily. So that is the dose we have decided by IDB Pulse. So that is dose we are using.
Okay, Dr. VP Singh, there are also reports people are using both tocilizumab and steroid, and some people feel because it is a cytokine storm and the main driving cytokine is IL-6. So before you start giving this IL-6 level should be measured, and since tocilizumab will be a very specific against this IL-6 which is driving this storm, and steroid are actually much more comprehensive anti-inflammatory drugs, and they may actually also suppress a good immunity, which is useful for containing the virus. So what do you think it should be combined, or which one you think should be a better option in these cases?
I think basically this is all case reports and data, not a clinical trial most of the thing. So people have used tocilizumab single dose with much more efficacy and clear-cut answer rather than using a steroid actually. However, steroid has been recommended the surviving sepsis guideline that you can use in a severe ARDS for 1 week. Otherwise, most of these data is just like experimental basis not on the very foolproof trial. So that is what probably the tocilizumab would be the ideal IL-6 inhibitor to be used in this situation.
Okay. So another very important thing which is being noticed in this patient is a kind of hypercoagulable state, and many of these patients, even though they are on prophylactic anticoagulations, they develop multiple thrombi, not only in their venous system, DVTs and pulmonary embolism, but also in the arteries, So this kind of hypercoagulable state as a part of DIC is very specific to this condition, because you don't see, in the DIC you have these patients are prone to develop thrombosis and also bleeding. The bleeding is not very commonly seen, but what you see is a kind of a very hypercoagulable state that in many cases they find that there is a kind of heparin resistance, and they really have to use either full dose enoxaparin or maybe heparin infusion in such cases. So what do you think, what will be your approach in a situation like this, Dr. Vijay Kumar?
Yeah, I think a lot of theories have been put forward for this thrombosis. One of the most important is the virus attacks the RBC, breaking it, separating the heme and the iron. And there is a lot of circulating iron. And after some time, the RBC dies. And the body perceives that, and then it produces a lot of erythropoietin. Because of that, a lot of new RBCs are flooding the entire circulation, which is resulting in the thrombosis. So I think small studies, but they have shown that when they have used anticoagulants, definitely the oxygenation is much better, improvement is much better, and the survival is better. I think in those patients, that is the reason why you are mentioning about the cytokine storm, in which they use the H score. That also includes the measurement of the platelets in addition to the C-reactive proteins and the ferritin levels. So if these are showing very high scores, then it means cytokine storm is definitely there, and these patients will definitely benefit from using anticoagulants.
Dr. Hadda, normally in DIC, we see low fibrinogen level, and PT and APTT levels are usually higher, and there is thrombocytopenia. In this kind of DIC, we are seeing the fibrinogen levels are also high. So like what you see in chronic DIC. So what do you think? Is it a kind of mechanism or pathophysiology? Is it something very specific to this COVID-19? And what is your approach to managing this? In fact, I've seen some patients in some situation where there is arterial thrombosis, people are also using aspirin along with the heparin infusion. So what is your view about it?
I think the pathophysiology has been well described by Dr. Vijay Kumar, so nothing to add to that. But as far as the management is concerned, all of us know that management of DIC in ICU as such is also very difficult, very challenging, and probably there is no specific treatment of DIC per se. We hope that we treat the underlying cause and the process will recover and DIC will be settled. Similarly, the same theory we apply with COVID, again, probably there is no specific therapy, but as a policy, all the patients who are having COVID disease, we give anticoagulant in the form of heparin, low molecular heparin. We are giving to all of the patients as a prophylactic dose, and in hope that there will be lesser chances of this thrombosis. But as you told, there are few people have used the anticoagulant oral also. So there are anecdotal reports for that also. But we are not routinely using. We are just using heparin, low molecular weight heparin as a standard DVT prophylaxis dose.
Dr. VP Singh, do you like to add something?
It's already been covered. Actually, as you have mentioned, the slow chronic DIC-like picture is there in few of the patients, and that is where they have used this heparin infusion in the management. Otherwise, the standard low molecular weight heparin for the most of the patient will do, I think.
Okay, thank you, thank you. So what we basically, most of these patients should be actually on prophylactic heparin dosages, but once there are some indications from studies from China that if the D-dimer level goes beyond 1000 or 2000, then they start giving them full dose of enoxaparin. And once there is an actual evidence of DVTs and thromboprophylaxis, heparin infusions are being given to this patient. So this is the way the patients are being managed as per the reports from different countries. I think, Sushant, can we take questions now?
Thank you so much. In fact, we have covered most of the topics that what people are referring to. So I was reading the questions side by side. I had one questions to ask probably to Dr. Vijay Hadda, sir. Sir, in couple of articles and webinars, we read that some of these patients who were initially managed on a CPAP and then moved to then they were intubated and moved to an invasive ventilator had slightly worse prognosis. So is that also linked to a particular phenotype or it's a general phenomena? And linked to this, there was a question, which is the mode that you use while you intubate these patients? I think one of the audience has asked that.
So I think some part we discussed, the patient who are managed with use of either CPAP or BiPAP. There is one phenomena called as patient-induced self-lung injury. So basically, when we are giving NIV to these patients, their respiratory drive is so high that they keep on inhaling more and more volume. So they don't have any volume control. So that lead to the overstretching of alveoli and that start a cascade of the inflammation. So that lead to the lung injury. So probably that is one cause why these patients who are on managed with NIV or CPAP, if they goes down or they worsen, then chances of the worse outcome is more. That probably explains what is the pathophysiology behind it.
I think it is more related to the timing of intubation. As we mentioned, that if you do decide to give them non-invasive means of oxygenation, you must monitor them very closely. And if there are signs of rapid deterioration, then you should not actually let them become acutely ill that you had to go in for crash intubation. So this is the situation probably the question mentioned. So we should be very vigilant, and our threshold to intubate these patients should be very low. And the moment we feel that whatever non-invasive measure we are taking, CPAP or high flow nasal cannula or maybe rebreathing mask, if the patient is progressively deteriorating, I think they should be electively early intubated so that you can do them in a much better and planned way.
Can I add one point?
Yeah.
Here?
Sure.
Yeah. The two big studies, one by Brochard and another by Plant. In both the series, it was found that those patients who were put on NIV, they don't do well. And then they were shifted to the intubation and ventilation. There, the mortality was high. So it only goes to show they didn't do well because the pathology was very severe. And probably they didn't do well and they were intubated little very late. So for these two reasons, their mortality is high. This is in non-COVID patients in the other population like COPD, etc. So if we extrapolate the same two factors into COVID patients also, then I think it will explain, like Dr. Suri rightly mentioned, that we should be very vigilant. Every 1 hour, we have to keep checking these patients who are on the NIV. And at the earliest indication, I think we should intubate them.
Thank you so much, sir. So the question was, what will be the mode when you intubate them? What will be the mode that you want to keep them on? And also, if there is any difference in the radiological findings, let's say CT findings of a COVID patient and a normal, otherwise ARDS patient.
I think the radiological finding of COVID has been well described, and common finding which has been described are patchy consolidation, peripheral at initial stages, or then ground glassing and lower lobe predominant, bilateral. But these are just suggestive. There is no pathognomic finding of COVID that if this finding is there, then it is COVID only. They are just like other any viral illness, just like H1N1 influenza we see. The same kind of finding are there, bilateral pneumonia, more of ground glassing. So I think based only on city, it will be very, very difficult to say that this is COVID.
Anything, Dr. Vijay Kumar, you want to say? The modes we talked that you have to use low lung volume strategy like ARDS, NET, this thing, and the PEEP needs to be treated. It's like a dose dependent titration, and depending on the patient's compliance at what stage the patient is, patient can be managed. I think most of the time people are using that ARDS net trial PEEP titration method. They are using. You should target the tidal volume of 4 to 6 ml per kg body weight. And recently, as I mentioned to you, many people feel that APRV is a much better mode of managing these cases because it results into slow recruitment of these cases.
I think the general principles of mechanical ventilation do not really differ a lot from what we have been doing all these years and to the COVID patients. The initial resting modes like assist control mode and pressure control mode are started, and patients are paralyzed and sedated on day 1 and 2. And then, of course, the recruiting modes such as SIMV mode, etc., will start once the patient starts improving. And then, of course, we have the weaning modes like pressure control or SIMV with pressure support that comes later. So I think general principles will remain the same. The only thing is when it comes to tidal volume, we should be a little careful because we follow the ARDS-NET trial. And then PEEP need not be increased to the extent that we do it in non-COVID ARDS, and it has to be according to the physiology, according to the plateau pressure.
I think two more important things to be mentioned here. One, proning of these patients. If you feel that with the proper use of low tidal volume strategy, if the patient response is not good, then they should be proned early, and the proning should be for at least 12 to 16 hours per day. That's one thing. And second thing is that, this, as you have said, two types of phenotypes. This viral replication, when it occurs early in the disease, it specifically affects the surfactant. And with the involvement of the surfactant, the alveoli become very unstable. So even after, when you try to wean them off, as Dr. Vijay Kumar was telling, there may be a higher rate of reintubation because the lungs are very unstable. So now many people recommend that instead of prolonging their mechanical ventilation beyond a particular period and tracheostomy and doing tracheostomy on them, they can be actually taken into CPAP or high flow nasal cannula. These things, so that you provide some kinds of positive pressure support to stabilize their lung and to keep their gas exchange going on for this thing. So these are two also important things which has been observed, because otherwise these patients has to be put on to ventilator for 3 weeks, 4 weeks long, because their lungs remains unstable, and the moment and they may require very little positive pressure or a CPAP to stabilize their lung and keep the gas exchange going on. So that is also another option, which one has to take into account. Any next question?
Some of the other questions we have discussed in details about the CPAP and when to use, and also we've discussed about the D-dimer. You specifically asked that. So I believe we have covered most of the questions. I would request if all of you would like to make a concluding statement. In any case, we are touching 6 o'clock. If you would like that.
Yeah, Dr. Vijay Kumar.
Yeah. So initially, when patients' details started coming from Wuhan, China, we were all thinking that it is the ARDS which is very important. We have to jump onto the patient, intubate and ventilate, and we need more ventilators. That is why all over the world there was a demand for increasing the ventilators. And quickly, all of us, we started making our own inventory. For example, India, I believe, has got about 40,000 ventilators. So we quickly calculated speculated that we need more ventilators. So similarly, all countries started with that. Then when the COVID-19 started spreading to the Europe and America, then there was a lot of scientific publications coming at a very rapid state, and a lot of pathophysiology coming, and a lot of experts jumping into and then trying to explain. And now we know words like cytokine storm, and how there is a lot of ferritin circulating in the body, and this ferritin is extra ion which is circulating in the circulation is handled by three things. One, the most important, macrophage, which engulfs this. And second, the epithelium of the alveoli, and in the process, it gets damaged. And number three, the liver. That's the reason why many of these COVID-19 patients have got large livers and large spleen, because of the consumption of this iron into these organs. So I think the more we are dealing with this COVID-19 infection, we are learning more and more. And already a lot of trials have been started, trials on chloroquine, tocilizumab, and so many other monoclonal antibodies, antivirals. So I think maybe in another 6 months to 10 months, I think we'll be getting a lot of solid data, a lot of solid information about which works and which doesn't work. And maybe by the end of another 18 months or so, probably we'll be having another 3-4 vaccines as well.
Dr. Hadda?
I think, sir, because this is a totally new disease, so all of us, whatever we say, our knowledge for treatment decision, whatever we are taking or managing patients, is based on very limited kind of knowledge, and we should recognize that we have a big limitation. But what my request is, anybody who is listening or who is interested in COVID management, all of us should try to collect the data in an organized fashion, so that we can understand what is happening to our patients. Because whatever data we are considering today or consulting today is from other countries. We don't know how we are behaving, why the mortality rate, the infection rate is not so high as compared to other countries. I have no idea why the US and UK or maybe European countries, suddenly patient number went into lakhs, and whereas in India just 15,000. Similarly, mortality is totally different, and is this something to do with the other infections which are prevalent in country, like TB or maybe BCG vaccine or maybe malaria endemic kind of thing? We don't know. So all of us, we have a duty that all of us put our all foot forward to try to answer all these questions, because we have a unique kind of situation, we have unique challenges. So we put all the effort so that we should have at least idea what is happening to our population. If that can be done, probably this will give the final answer what to do and what is required to our society.
Dr. BP Singh?
I think everything is being said, and just want to add only thing that it is a novel disease, novel coronavirus. We don't have experience with this disease in the past. So we have to rather see how the things are moving in forward direction with the experience of the others. It has seen that almost 80% of the patients, they are having mild disease, 20% they have the severe disease. Of them, 5% require the ICU, and around 2.5% have the mortality. And with this data, probably we are evolving, and we have to see how we are behaving in the future and how our population is dealing with this disease and what will the outcome. As Dr. Hadda has mentioned, that we have to develop our own data, and we have to look very closely how our patients are behaving, and then we can develop a proper strategy to counter this disease. I think this is the most important thing, what I feel.
Yeah, I fully agree with you. So we all know that we are dealing with a new disease, which is only 3 to 4 months old, and the information about this is continuously evolving. We initially thought that it is probably purely a viral pneumonia, and the disease is confined to only lungs. But now we know that though in 80% of the cases it is self-limiting and most of the patient becomes okay, but then 20% of the patient do get hospitalized, and out of this 5% get into the ICU. And in these patients, the disease is not confined to the lung. Actually, we have in them a kind of a very hypercoagulable state. They develop DIC with diffuse with multiple thrombi in the veins, in the arteries, and they also develop cytokine storm. With that, their condition become much more serious, and they develop multi-organ dysfunction. Their lung becomes severely bad with the ARDS. There is also involvement of the liver, there is involvement of kidney. What kind of kidney injury they have, there is also a lot of controversy, whether it is directly due to the viral through those angiotensin receptors, or it is a acute tubular necrosis, what we see normally in sepsis. And also there is involvement of the heart. So many patients develop myocarditis and other things. So the information is continuously evolving. Where we are at present is that we don't have any definitive therapy. We don't have any vaccine. We don't have any drug treatment so far. There are some repurposed drugs which are being used, like hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin, but we don't have any strong data to support this through randomized controlled trials. We have 2 trials coming from China, 2 RCTs, and some data from France, which is not very, I think, well conducted study. So in nutshell, I can say that we don't have any definitive therapy. By and large, treatment remains supportive. And this is the way we are. And today, whatever we have discussed is basically on the basis of what information is available. And maybe what we have discussed today may be obsolete after 1 week. We have to continuously, keep evolving depending upon the new information we get on day-to-day basis. With this, I would really like to thank my all distinguished panelists for their wonderful inputs. And I'm sure all the people who have been listening must have been benefited with their inputs, and they'll find themselves enriched knowledge-wise to deal with their patient in a better way. And I would also like to thank Dr. Sushant and all the team of Philips for hosting this event. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to all the participants who joined and took active participation in asking questions. And obviously the esteemed panel, starting from Dr. Vijay Hadda, sir. Thank you so much. Dr. BP Singh, sir. Thank you so much. Dr. Vijay Kumar, sir. And certainly Dr. JC Suri, sir, for being the moderator and conducting the channel. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Please take care and have a good night. Thank you.